Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 living card games. Living card games, or LCGs, are a style of game that I really enjoy. Now, to explain a little bit what a living card game is, basically these are a line of games within the Fantasy Flight Games catalog. And basically these games are a response to the CCG, the collectible card game, games like Magic the Gathering. And these games are usually tactical card games that involve an element of collectability, an element of customization as players buy additional content to add to the core content that they buy originally. Now, this is a style of game that I really enjoy, really appreciate. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list. My number 10 LCG, or living card game, is actually not a number 10 at all, because I actually do not have 10 LCGs that I have played. So I will move on to my number 9 living card game, and that is Star Wars, the card game. And this here is designed by Eric M. Lang and has the very popular Star Wars intellectual property. And this game is a two-player only tactical card game where one player represents one side of the Force, the good side, the light, and the other player plays the side of the dark side of the Force. And each of the respective sides are divided into 3 different factions that players can use to construct their decks, and each of the factions have different strengths and different weaknesses, and basically players construct their deck based on those factions that they choose to play with. This game is very asymmetric. I say it's one of the more asymmetric games, not the most, that you'll find on this list, but one of the more asymmetric games because the winning conditions for the dark side as opposed to the light side are totally different. Now, if you're a fan of the Star Wars game, or the Star Wars intellectual property, I think you will like this. Otherwise, I'm not sure if I'll recommend it, because this is one of the more fiddly of the living card games that I have here. Most of the living card games can be a little bit fiddly, but this one here is probably the least streamlined, the most upkeep, a lot of different things that players have to keep in mind from turn to turn, a lot of text reading. All of these games, these kind of games, living card games, involve reading the text. I find that this game has a little bit more text reading than some of the other games. So because of that, it's not necessarily my favorite, although I do enjoy the Star Wars intellectual property. My number 9 living card game, Star Wars, the card game. Now we move on to my number 8 living card game, and that is Keyforge. And the reason why Keyforge is ranked number 8, it actually probably would be ranked higher on the list, but technically Keyforge is not a living card game. So I guess this is really a top 8 living card games. But Keyforge is from the same publisher as the living card games, Fantasy Flight Games, and has lots of similarities. This here tends to be more like the collectible model as opposed to the living card game. You do not buy expansions with predetermined content as you do with the living card games. Instead, you buy pre-made decks that are unique from one another. Whenever you buy a deck, you're going to have a unique configuration of cards, a unique combination of different factions and the particular cards within it that's going to be distinguished from any other deck in the world. That's kind of like the gimmick of this game, that each deck has a different configuration than the other decks that you purchase. And the excitement of opening a deck and seeing what you have, kind of like the same experience with a collectible game, except you know that it's already valuable content. It's pre-made. You're not just buying a bunch of worthless commons. You're getting a complete deck that's ready for play the next time you go at it and to play this game. And this is a 2-player game, just like most of these type of games where players are trying to forge their keys. They got 3 different keys that they're trying to forge, and they are playing, combating with their opponent in order to accrue this resource referred to as Ember. And once you have a certain amount of Ember, you pay to unlock or open up one of your key forges. And the first player to unlock 3 of their key forges will be the winner of the game. I like the variability. I like the collectible aspect of it with some semblance of control. My number 8 living card game, if you will, Keyforge. And now we move on to my number 7, and from this point forward there is no cheating. These are all living card games from Fantasy Flight, and my number 7 living card game is Warhammer Conquest, designed by Eric Lang, Nate French, and Brad Andres. And this here is a game that takes place within the Warhammer 40k universe, which I must admit I don't know too much about Warhammer lore, in particular Warhammer 40k. So that doesn't help me as far as the game is concerned. But I do like the gameplay. This game comes with tons of different factions for those who are familiar with Warhammer lore. I believe there are 7 factions that players can use for deck construction just in the base game alone. If you can get an expansion, your hands on an expansion, I think it opens up to an 8th possible faction that players can use for their deck construction. I will admit it's hard to find a lot of these expansions. The base game here is also out of print, but you can find used copies secondhand on eBay or on the geek market for reasonable prices. But some of these expansions are a little bit harder to find than others. But this game here, really cool, all the different factions and how they play and their different strengths. And basically players are lining up all these different locations that represent different planets. And players are competing each of these planets in order to control them. And the goal of the game is to have a certain amount of planets of a given type in your victory pool at the end of the game. You're trying to be the first player to collect several planets of the same type or of a specific type. And if you're able to do that, then you will win the game. So it's not only about warring or vying for supremacy in these different locations. It's particularly which locations you want to target, which ones are helpful towards your winning condition, and which ones will prevent or slow down your opponent's winning condition. Lots of stuff here. I've been able to get lots of these smaller expansions at a very reasonable price, and one of the big box expansions I was able to acquire as well. However, some of the content, as I mentioned earlier, is hard to find, and there's not as much content for this game as there are for some of the other games that are higher on the list. That and the fact that I don't have that connection with the Warhammer 40k universe limit it to number 7, but it is a fine game nonetheless. My number 7 living card game, Warhammer Conquest. And now we move on to my number 6 living card game. And my number 6 is The Call of Cthulhu, the living card game. And I'm a big fan of the Cthulhu Mythos from Arkham Horror's file line of games in particular. And this here is also designed by Eric Lang and Nate French, 2 names that you'll see and hear a lot when referring to these living card games. And this is the original Cthulhu Mythos living card game. And there's tons of content out there for it. Just like Warhammer Conquest, this game is out of print, but most of the expansions you will be able to get at a reasonable price. Just like with Warhammer Conquest, there will be some expansions that are unreasonable as far as their pricing or harder to find. But I've got a good amount of content for this game, and this game also, like Warhammer Conquest, comes with 7 different factions that players can choose from. I believe the expansions add an 8th faction. And basically, all these factions are very asymmetric. They have different strengths and weaknesses. And in the base game, basically, to construct a deck, you're going to need 2 factions. So every deck is going to consist of 2 factions and a few neutral cards. This is a 2-player only game, as most of these living card games are. And players are trying to vie for areas in this game, but these areas in this game are referred to as story cards. And these story cards have different symbols, different icons that players are going to be competing. So each of your characters are competing in several different challenges in successive order. So you have to compete in insanity. Whoever has the most horror in their characters competing for that particular story card will make another person's character go insane, which means they'll be flipped upside down and they won't be available for the next couple turns. You're going to have some doom, some skulls that represent killing your characters. Whoever has the most will be able to kill an opponent's character on the other side. Then you're going to have your research icons, your magnifying glass. They'll be able to help you contribute successes onto those story cards. And whoever completes the most successes, or a certain amount of successes, I believe it's 5, will collect that story card. Whoever has the most story cards, or whoever collects 3 story cards first, will be the winner of the game. But there's always 3 story cards at a given time time up for contention. So you got to mix and match and balance and know when you're very likely to complete a certain story card and when you're less likely to do so. Maybe you don't want to invest too much in another story card that is for nothing. Also, these story cards, once they are completed and once they're run over, they trigger certain abilities that can be either positive or detrimental for all the players involved. So it's something to consider. Sometimes you might not want to win a particular story card at a given time, because if you do, you trigger a negative effect that actually will be detrimental to you as a player. Lots of great content, lots of interesting flavor text. This is not necessarily a thematic, immersive type of Cthulhu game like some of the more adventure style games. But if you like the intellectual property, if you like the Cthulhu Mythos, the Lovecraftian theme, you'll enjoy this game as well. My number 6 living card game, the Call of Cthulhu living card game. And now we move on to my number 5. We're moving on to the top 5, the cream of the crop. And my number 5 living card game is Android Netrunner, designed by Lucas Litzinger, and this is a reimagining of the original Netrunner by none other than Richard Garfield of Magic the Gathering fame. And I mentioned earlier that Star Wars the card game is one of the more asymmetric of the living card games that I have on this list. As a matter of fact, most of the living card games here are not very asymmetric at all. Both sides are trying to accomplish the same thing. Some of these living card games are cooperative, so obviously all sides are trying to accomplish the same thing. But other than Star Wars the card game, this is the only other asymmetric living card game, I would say. And it's even more asymmetric than Star Wars the card game, because even the terminology that's used to describe the different aspects of the components, the cards in your hand, the cards in your tableau, the cards in your deck and discard pile, even the terminology is different from one side to the other. And that's actually probably, while it's something to praise about this game, it's also actually something that holds it back, and probably is the reason why this game is at a 5. Because from an impression perspective, this game gave me the best first impression of all the living card games on this list. I was just marveled by how incredible this game was when I first played it. However, the complexity of teaching those opposite sides with the terminology and the different tactics and strategy that you're trying to employ from one side versus the other makes it such a difficult game to teach that I've actually only taught this game to one other person. So I don't play this game as often as some of the others, and I'm not necessarily excited about the prospect of teaching it to other people. So again, that holds it back. But again, from a thematic perspective, one player is taking on the role of the Netrunner, the hackers, and the other player is taking on the role of the evil corporations, and they're basically trying to play a game of chicken, trying to hide their agendas from the Netrunner and trying to camouflage and perhaps trick the Netrunner into breaking into particular servers that actually have nothing there of value, maybe some assets that serve as a decoy, but there is no agenda there. And little by little, you're trying to advance your agendas, because if you score a certain amount of agenda points, you'll win the game as the corporation. But if the Netrunner is able to break through your servers and collect a certain amount of points worth of agendas from your servers, then they will win the game. Really cool, really neat. There's 4 different factions to play from the corporation perspective, 4 different corporations, and there's 3 factions from the Netrunner here in the base game alone. My number 5 living card game of all time, Android Netrunner. My number 4 living card game is probably going to disappoint some people because it probably would be their number 1. But my number 4 is Arkham Horror, the living card game. And as I mentioned earlier with the Call of Cthulhu, the card game, I'm a big fan of the Cthulhu Mythos, and in particular the Arkham Horror file line of games. These adventure style games, as I mentioned, Call of Cthulhu is strictly just a 2-player tactical card game, while Arkham Horror, the card game, simulates the adventure experience of a game like Arkham Horror, of a game like Eldritch Horror or Mansions of Madness. It simulates that same kind of feel. However, all of the components consist of cards. So all of your characters, your monsters, your assets, your items, your allies, they're all going to be card-based. And this game is really cool from a narrative perspective. Of all the Arkham Horror file games, this is the most at narrative driven. You've got your agenda cards and your act cards, and all of these cards are driving the narrative forward. Not to mention your campaign manual, which basically gives you an introduction to the particular scenario you're partaking in. And at the end, when you've completed that scenario, it gives you a resolution text for you to read. Really cool from that perspective. I've only played the base game for Arkham Horror, the living card game, and maybe that is why it's only ranking as high as number 4. Maybe as I expand and try other scenarios and play additional expansion content, maybe that will add to the game. Maybe once I delve more into the deck construction aspect of the game, maybe that'll help for the game. But for now, it suffices that it's number 4. I like all of the different characters. I think the base game comes with 5 or 6 different investigators that players can choose from, and they have their recommended starting decks. But once you've played with them and gotten acclimated to the different decks, you can play a little bit with deck building. However, there's not as much options in the base game. You're probably going to have to get a second box of the base game, or as I mentioned, some of the expansions in order to have more customization options. But it's just fine. I love the suspense. I love the different levels of difficulty. Instead of resolving skill checks by rolling of dice, as in most of your Arkham Horror file games, you do so by playing these or pulling out these tokens that serve as the modifiers to whatever your skill or attribute scores might be. I find that to be a very exciting aspect, just pulling this out and seeing what happens. A level of probability, but not necessarily dice-based. So it's really cool. Just like this game, it's again, the Cthulhu Mythos aspect of it really helps it, and I'm curious to see if it will rise to the list as I play more content for it. But for now, it's my number 4 living card game, Arkham Horror, the card game. And now we move on to my number 3, and my number 3 is The Lord of the Rings, the living card game. Yet another cooperative adventure-based game from Nate French. This is actually a solo design by Nate French, and it's based on the Lord of the Rings intellectual property, J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth universe. And I'm a big fan of that IP. I'm a big fan of the lore. I'm a big fan of the characters, the world, the universe that is Middle-earth. So I'm very excited every time I play this game. And just like Arkham Horror, the living card game, this is a cooperative game for 1 to 2 players with just this core box here. If you buy a second box, you'll be able to play up to 4 players. But the truth is, just like Arkham Horror, the living card game, I mostly play this game solo. These games are very enjoyable to play solo. And players are basically constructing their decks off these different factions. There's 4 different factions. You got lore, you got tactics, you got spirit. I forgot what's the name of the 4th faction. But you got all these different factions, and you could play monolithic, where your deck consists of just 1 faction, or you can mix 2 factions. You shouldn't mix more than 2. And you'll have some heroes, which are very powerful characters that are always available at your tableau. They give you particular benefits and special actions, and they also have high stat values for the main aspects of the game, namely your willpower, which will help you explore and quest successfully. And you also have your attack values and your defense values, which will help you fight enemies and protect yourself from them. Throughout the course of the game, you're playing different types of cards, mainly your allies, which will add to your willpower scores, which will add to your attack and defense scores in order to combat these enemies. And there's all of these different scenarios, these different quests. I've only played the base game. The base game comes with 3 different scenarios, revving up in difficulty, but playing radically different from one another as well. So I feel that when I play additional expansion content, besides the deck customization options and the variety in the scenarios, that might help the game. As it is, it's really high. Number 3, the Lord of the Rings theme, helping it a lot. My number 3 living card game, Lord of the Rings, the living card game. And now we move on to my number 2, and it was very close between my number 2 and my number 3. My number 1, I would say, was a distant favorite, but my number 2 and 3, I wrestled about it, but I'm going to go with number 2, and that is A Game of Thrones, the living card game. And for this one, I actually do have 2 boxes in order to give more options for deck construction and customization. The Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin's Westeros, A Song of Ice and Fire universe. Very popular intellectual property. I enjoy the series. I enjoy the books. I enjoy the characters, the lore, the intrigue. And this game here is the only game in this entire list that is a competitive game for more than 2 players. All these other games are either cooperative games that can accommodate more than 2 players, or they are competitive games that are 2-player only. However, Game of Thrones, the living card game, just with the base game alone, you could play 4 players. If you get 2 boxes, you can play up to 6 players and really get that Game of Thrones experience. Now, the cool thing about this game is that when you play lots of these higher player counts, in order to prevent players from necessarily bullying or picking on 1 or 2 guys, instead, you have these title cards, which basically simulate the different titles within the small council. You have your Master of Ships and your Master of Coin, and all these different roles, your Master of Whispers, and basically, each round, you're drafting from these titles, and that's who you are this round. Whatever faction you have remains the same, your House Targaryen or your House Stark, but your title within the small council changes, and that title, not only does it give you a special power for that current round, but it incentivizes you or tells you to focus on a particular house or a particular other title as your enemy for that round, and it prevents you from attacking certain characters, certain titles within the small council for that given round. So that little draft before each round is actually very cool because it's like a little bit of a hidden role selection that can protect you from someone else around the table. If you know that someone is targeting you, you can pick a title, you can anticipate which title you think they would draft, and you would draft a title based on that. I find that to be a really neat feature to the game. Players are competing in 3 different spheres of challenges. You got your military challenges, you got your intrigue challenges, and you got your power challenges. And ultimately, that is what the game is about. It's about power. You're trying to be the first player to collect 15 power tokens, and that will win you the game. Lots of cool stuff in this game. Again, if you like the intellectual property in particular, then I think this is a must-have. My number 2 living card game, A Game of Thrones, the card game. And now we move on to my number 1, the favorite game for me, and many of you might have guessed it, because besides Arkham Horror living card game, I think this is the only other game that rivals it and as far as popularity is concerned, and that is Marvel Champions. And I'm a big Marvel fan from days of old, big comic book fan, in particular a big Spider-Man fan. I'm a big fan of the MCU as well. And I really just enjoy this universe. And playing Marvel Champions is such a fun game, just like Lord of the Rings and Arkham Horror before it. This is a cooperative game for 1 to 4 players. The one time I played 4 players, I will admit the game was too long. It just didn't feel right. But at 2 or 3 players, this game is fine. I do enjoy playing it solo mostly, as Lord of the Rings and Arkham Horror, the living card game. And here, just like these games, I've only played the base game. It comes with 5 characters. You got Spider-Man, you've got Iron Man, you've got Black Panther, you've got Captain Marvel, and you've got She-Hulk. Good amount of characters. It comes with 3 different villains or 3 different scenarios that players are combating against, and they rev up in difficulty as well. It is such a fun experience because players are controlling one character and their deck is based off one character. So let's say you're Spider-Man, but you're also Peter Parker. So you're alternating between your alter ego and your hero form and making the choice from round to round and turn to turn, when is it most convenient to be in one form versus another? Because there's certain actions that you can only take in one form or the other, and there's certain detriments, certain threats that you face from the villain, depending on which side you have chosen for that given round, the alter ego or the hero form. So striking that right balance is really cool. Also, your cards are multi-purpose. Not only are your cards going to be the actions and the allies and the upgrades and the events that you play, but your cards also have a currency, a resource on it, and that resource is the money that you're using to pay for the cards. So you find yourself in a situation where sometimes you have to use a card you really like to pay for another card that you like even more. But you have to react to it tactically. Right then and right there, what is the best option for you? And sometimes hindsight is 20/20, and you end up regretting the decision you had made. So I love the challenge of picking which cards I want to use and which cards I can't, having a limited hand size at the end of each round so you don't necessarily have all of these cards to work with. Really cool, really neat, balancing between your character's health, because you can be knocked out and eliminated from the game, and knowing when to recover. Really cool. I really enjoy it. I'm excited of trying more content for this game. But for now, it's enough to be my #1 living card game of all time, Marvel Champions. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here at Warhammer Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what you think about this particular list. What's your favorite living card game of all time? Also, if you are a fan of the Legends of the Five Rings, please comment down below because that's one living card game I have not played as of yet. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining us here when Harry met board games. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.